thank you all for coming to what I think is going to be a wonderful presentation. I'll just briefly, let me introduce our speaker, Nathaniel Andrade, Nate to his friends, is a classical historian and also the chair of the history department. So last year he was my boss. Anyhow, Nate, despite his youth and so forth, is a remarkably productive scholar. Let me just read you the names of his books already that he has published. In 2013, he published Syrian Identity in the Greco-Roman World. 2018, The Journey of Christianity to India in Late Antiquity. That same year, Zenobia, Shooting Star of Palmyra. I can't tell you exactly what that is about. I'm sure you could. And his topic for today on the trial of Jesus is going to be the centerpiece of the new book that he's now working on. So we're privileged to get, sort of the early version of this before it goes out to the world in book. So Nate, thank you very much for coming.
Oh, you're welcome. And thank you, John, for this generous invitation, and thank you all for being here. I'm really thrilled at this opportunity to share some of my current research with you. And I also will add that I'm going to be scheduled to teach a course on this same topic at the Lyceum in the spring. So if you're interested in this in more detail, I certainly welcome seeing you at the course. Anyhow, as John has indicated, I'm really a Roman historian, a historian of the Roman Middle East. And that's in many ways the angle from which I'm approaching the trial of Jesus of Nazareth. What's been sort of adventurous about the project is that I've had to deal a lot with New Testament studies, even though that's not really my background training. So whether that's an advantage or a disadvantage is something that I'm not sure about, but I guess it's up, not really for me to decide that in the end, I suppose. Before I start to talk a little bit about the trial of Jesus, I just wanted to give you an indication of what you're currently looking at the screen. So there you can see the Al-Aqsa Mosque of Jerusalem, and there you can see this massive platform that really dominates the topography of the east end of old Jerusalem. And that's basically where the Second Temple precinct was located. And this flattened out platform was built by a king named Herod I, who was both the client king of the Roman Empire, but also in essence a Roman governor. And that's something I'm going to be talking a bit more about. You're probably familiar with him from the Gospel of Matthew, where he's portrayed as doing some awful things because he's afraid of the baby Jesus's messianic stature, the notion that he's a king might renew the kingdom of God in Israel. And Herod's very much opposed to this. And that's going to be a thread to which we return. But I just wanted you to have a sense of the massive precinct where Jesus was active in the final week of his life. Now, what I'm doing in this book is I'm basically trying to understand Pilate's legal pathway to convicting Jesus of a crime and crucifying him. This is not easy to do. What exactly happened in the trial is heavily debated in historical terms. There's probably never going to be a way to prove conclusively what happened. I think people are introducing various scenarios, some that maybe are stronger than others. And this is one reason why this topic has really been debated at length for centuries. So whether we resolve it today perhaps is doubtful. But I'm going to give you my version, and I'm certainly interested in hearing yours in the Q&A. I'll try to speak for about 35 minutes, and then we can have something of a brief conversation. But the reason why people write about this and have so much variety is because for many scholars, not necessarily all of them, but for quite many, the way that the trial of Jesus plays out in the gospel narratives doesn't always really make the most sense. Now, each of the four New Testament gospels gives a different version of the trial, but they all basically do the same thing in the sense that they portray Pilate as believing in Jesus's innocence while deciding to kill him anyway, and to do it with what Romans consider to be one of the most inhumane forms of capital punishment, typically reserved for insurrectionists, seditionists, and bandits, who for the Romans are basically the worst people you can possibly be. So the question raises, would a Roman governor really do this? Basically, in some announce that someone is actually innocent or fundamentally believe that they're innocent, and then kill him in such an awful fashion because certain people want him to in the gospel narratives. These are the chief priests, of course, of the crowd attending Jesus's trial. Now, the reason why, to some degree, this is a very high stakes question is because in the history of global anti-Semitism, right? A lot of blame or responsibility has been placed with Jews for the death of Jesus. But when we look at the gospel narratives, we have to ask the question, who is really responsible here? Are the gospels accurate in laying responsibility with the chief priest? Are they accurate in shifting it away from Roman authority figures like Pontius Pilate? And the reason why the gospels portray Pilate in this way is because Roman governors were known to be unaccountable and capricious, and they could get away with a lot of bad behavior. But something else that we also know is that one of the few things Roman governors as judges weren't supposed to do was kill obviously innocent people without convicting them of an actual crime. So on this basis, people often are trying to formulate what is the crime that Pilate is identifying. This doesn't mean that Jesus deserved to die, of course, but it's reasonable to ask, did Pilate identify something Jesus did as criminal behavior? And if so, what was it? And that's what I'm going to be exploring quite a bit. Now, on the basis of the gospel accounts and the high stakes in the history of global anti-Semitism that are raised by the issue, scholars have reconstructed Jesus's final week alive in a variety of ways. And I will talk a bit more about the gospels as historical sources later. But the basic gist is that people are looking at the New Testament Gospels and they're trying to identify what parts of it are historical and what parts of it are perhaps later contrivances, maybe a bit more fabricated. And as a result, basically all the topics on the board you can see here have been debated in one form or another. Did Jesus really claim to be some sort of messianic figure, right? A concept that had regal connotations in Jewish society? Did he really have a confrontational moment with people at the temple precinct? Or is that something invented by the Gospels to shift responsibility to the chief priest and perhaps away from Pontius Pilate? Who arrested Jesus? Different Gospels say somewhat different things, and we'll talk a bit more about that later on. Was there really a hearing by a court organized by the chief priest in which Jesus was convicted of, say, blasphemy or a similar crime, or deemed liable for a capital charge? Again, some people argue that this is an invention of the Gospels, whose intention is to shift responsibility away from Roman authority and to Jewish priestly authority. What was the charge that Pilate convicted Jesus of? Would he really have killed someone he believed to be innocent without convicting him of a crime? And if there was a crime, what was it? Was it a crime as defined by, say, Jewish legal standards like blasphemy? Or would Jesus have had to have done something that a Roman governor would have thought was criminal behavior from the vantage point of actual Roman authority? And something else that gets debated is whether or not Jesus was actually executed with any followers of his. The gospel accounts seem to indicate no, but sometimes when people think about the seditionists or criminals that were flanking Jesus, they wonder whether maybe they were affiliated, and then the gospels rework that tradition to make it look like they're not. This is a very inadequate summary of all the variations that exist in about 100 years of scholarship, so I've done my best to synthesize it here. But the more that one reads on the topic, the more one encounters variation on what I'm outlining. But those are the stakes, and that's basically the material that we're handling today. Now, you have a sense of where I'm going with the presentation. I'm going to give you what I think to be Jesus's crime, not in a universal sense, but by Pilate's vantage point, what Pilate thought was criminal behavior. But before proceeding to that, I just wanted to give a sense of the broader context and communicate to you how legal systems worked in the Roman Empire and courts worked. Because the Roman Empire technically didn't have a single legal system. What you basically had various courts organized by different power holders or ethnic groups that basically had their own legal division of labor. And that's what I want to be outlining for the next few moments. So the most senior judge in the Roman Empire is the Roman emperor. During Jesus's lifetime, this is the Emperor Augustus and then the Emperor Tiberius. And just beneath Roman emperors in heavily militarized provinces are basically senators from Italy, who have consular rank, so they're quite senior. And the one most relevant for present purposes is the consular governor of Syria. So if you can see Syria coded in red on this map here, that's basically the most senior judge in the Middle East when Jesus is alive. Beneath consular governors are two types of people who basically have equal authority and often the power to execute convicts. One are equestrian governors, who come from Italy, and they typically govern a district while being subordinated to a consular governor. This is Pontius Pilate right here, the equestrian governor of the district of Judea, which is subordinated to the province of Syria. Equal in power to equestrian governors are what we often call client kings. And these are basically people that are in effect Roman governors, but they come from indigenous royal dynasties that the Romans have decided to support. In Galilee, which is for most of his life the home of Jesus of Nazareth, the ruler is Herod Antipas, the son of that Herod that I mentioned a bit earlier. So even though he comes from a Jewish dynasty and Herod Antipas never has the title of king, but he's a client dynast, he's very much a figure of Roman authority with basically the same powers as Pilate, and he has his own court where he is the judge and can convict people of crimes. Now, beneath the equestrian governors and the client kings are senates or councils of local elites who do a fair amount of civilian policing. They can actually arrest people. They organize a lot of the local politics. And in the case of our presentation, the main local senate you want to be aware of are basically the chief priest of the Jewish temple of Jerusalem. So they manage this massive temple precinct that Herod built. They oversee a lot of the sacred activities at the temple, but they also are basically local municipal figures of governance. And they do a certain amount of policing work, though in my view, this is debated. They technically can't do capital cases and executions. If they arrest someone on a capital charge, they have to go to Pilate or maybe Herod Antipas, depending on the situation. So there's a legal division of labor here. And when you read the Gospels, you glimpse that legal division of labor, actually. Different people doing different things that lead Jesus to being convicted by Pilate. Now, some background information on the chief priest of the temple that I want to share is that when they were living, they had a very stable following in the society of Judea and Jewish society, but they could also attract criticism and were fairly controversial. Now, when Herod I was king, that powerful king I told you about who rebuilt that temple precinct, he was not actually from a priestly family. So in order to build his royal legitimacy, he eliminated a lot of people of older priestly lines who could compete for authority. When I say eliminate, I mean he deposed a lot of priests at the temple and in some cases just actually killed them. And what he did to replace them was invite prominent families from the Jewish diaspora who weren't necessarily priests before to Jerusalem and Judea to live. So they became priests. They're affiliated with the Herodian dynasty. In many ways, they're aligned with Roman authority. And they also are given lots of land and become very wealthy. So the chief priests in this period are actually some of the biggest landowners in Judea. And they also are involved in a lot of tax collection and the like, where one can make profits. Now, the reason why I'm emphasizing this is because by the time Jesus is active, there are people in Jewish society, I tend to call them dissidents, who criticize the authority of the chief priest of the temple for various reasons. One is that they are, in fact, local governors who are working with Roman authority and Herodian authority. So they're the established political elite. They, in many ways, embody a hierarchy of wealth, which some Jews do not like because they think that that wealth is accumulated at the expense of, say, poor Jews. In the book of Exodus, priests are technically not really supposed to own land because their maintenance is paid for by tithes. During this period, priests have lots of land and they're still collecting tithes. They get some criticism for that. And in the book of Exodus, devout Jews are supposed to pay a tax to the temple once in their lifetime. By the time Jesus is around, that tax is expected to be paid every year to maintain that massive temple complex. Some of the criticisms of the chief priest appear in the Mishnah, which is a rabbinic corpus that was compiled a couple centuries after the period that we're discussing today. Some of the criticisms appear in the famous Dead Sea Scrolls, which are actually documents maintained or produced by Jews who are in many ways very critical of the priestly temple management. And many people argue that in the Gospels, you see traces of similar criticisms aired by Jesus of Nazareth or his followers, particularly in his final week alive. And so I just wanted to paint that broader picture for us. Now enter Pontius Pilate. When Pontius Pilate comes to Judea and he's expected to govern, His job, literally, as far as Roman legal texts tell us, is to kill bad men. And that's literally how it's phrased, right? Homines mali. He's supposed to eliminate them. But the question is, who are these bad men that Pontius Pilate is supposed to be eliminating to keep the peace? If you read the text carefully, it becomes clear that very often the bad men are basically insurrectionists, seditionists, bandits, or anyone who appears to be opposing the established political order and the established hierarchy of wealth. And in this period, the political order and hierarchy of wealth is in many ways embodied by the priest at the temple and the Herodian dynast and the Roman imperialists who are governing Judea at this time. What this basically means is that for someone like Pilate, someone who's opposing the chief priest and who might actually, run the risk of stimulating a disturbance or a riot or an insurrection is someone that he's actually very likely to target in practice. And a question that we all ask is whether Jesus might have fit that description at a certain point in his encounter with Pilate. Now, when governors go out to provinces, remarkably, they don't necessarily know much about laws. They may not have a lot of written statutes to define phenomena as criminal or not criminal. They are not legal professionals. So a judge like Pilate is not someone who has like lawyer training or jurist training. Their grasp of what is a written law might actually be very tenuous. Essentially what's happening is you're dealing with a legal amateur that's governing a province, and it's his job to define crimes on an ad hoc basis. And basically, they know a crime when they see one, more or less. Now, what this means is that different governors might have a different sense of what criminal behavior is. They may not define it consistently. They may have different senses of what's appropriate in terms of punishment. And what it also means is that their own moral biases and sense of ethics might really intrude. And if you're thinking of someone like Pontius Pilate, right, a member of the landed elite in Italy, who typically associates order with landed elites and associates bad men with people who oppose them. Well, this is one of the aspects of Jesus's preaching that could get him into trouble, potentially. So the gospel accounts and how we read them, and this is where I'm very much an outsider, though I've done my best to navigate the existing scholarship. Now, when people are handling the New Testament gospels as historical sources, they're asking the questions that historians like me or like John are often asking, right? If we're trying to understand whether a text is accurately representing a phenomenon, we do want to factor in things like biases, since in our experience, those always intrude on historical text. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you dismiss the spiritual truth of the Gospels or of the Jesus of the church. It just means that what happened historically might look a bit different from, say, the spiritual truth of the Gospels or the spiritual truth of Jesus. And for many New Testament scholars, the way that they typically think of things is that the Gospels are all written a generation or two or three after Jesus died. By the time they're written, Christianity has increasingly started to part ways with the religion of Judaism. And some of the things or the ways that they represent Jesus might impose a layer of Christian thinking onto the behaviors of someone who was a Second Temple Jew, engaging in debates that Second Temple Jews were having, with the big one being, what's the proper way to handle wealth? And what's the proper way to manage the temple at Jerusalem? Now, when the Gospels are composed, since, as I mentioned, they're composed in some cases generations after Jesus dies, essentially what has happened is that when Jesus hasn't returned yet, Romans have to figure out how to live in the Roman Empire without being executed as criminals or persecuted. And what's also happening is that Jews have engaged in various forms of insurgency, which have made them widely suspect in the eyes of Roman imperial authorities. As such, it's reasonable to suspect that the Gospels make an effort to make Jesus and his followers appear more harmless to Roman authority and to shift the responsibility for his execution to members of the priestly elite. And that's sort of the logic here. And for many people, that explains why Pilate's protesting his innocence and then killing him as if he's been convicted of what Romans would have thought of as a heinous crime like sedition or insurrection. Now, when I'm reading the Gospels as historical texts, something that I'm constantly doing is thinking about when they represent independent witnesses and when they may just be taking material from one another and adding other layers that may not be that accurate. And to give you a sense of my thinking, I thought we could start with the earliest gospel, at least widely accepted as the earliest, Mark. And what Mark says about the famous amnesty moment where Pilate offers Jesus to the crowd and asks whether the crowd wants him released. Now, Mark makes it clear that Pilate knows that Jesus was handed over to him because of personal hostility, not necessarily because he did something criminal. And all the Gospels basically say this in one form or another. What's perplexing is what Pilate allegedly says when he does this. He says, "Do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" So he doesn't say Jesus of Nazareth, which might be a neutral or even sympathetic way to present him. He uses the mocking title ascribed to Jesus by his enemies. Now, one way to read this is that the statement attributed to Pilate represents an earlier stratum where Pilate's actually hostile. He's not nearly as sympathetic as the Gospels purport him to be. And then Mark comes up with a clumsy way to try to explain this away. Oh, he knew that they just didn't like Jesus and they were handing him over. Now, what's intriguing is that Matthew, who, as far as I'm concerned, read Mark, sees this as a problem and reworks it a bit. So that when Pilate addresses the crowd, he actually calls Jesus by his name and then adds that some people call him the Christ or Messiah, right? A king, an anointed one. Now, Luke, who in my opinion have read both Mark and Matthew, has an interesting sequence where Pilate repeatedly states that he finds Jesus fundamentally innocent. But of course, we know how the story ends anyhow. Despite Pontius Pilate making such protests in Luke, he kills Jesus anyway. And then with John, who I think actually read Mark and Luke, that's just my personal opinion. What's intriguing is that you see a similar statement to what appears in Luke, right? Pilate just finds no guilt in Jesus whatsoever. But he also basically phrases the question more or less in the same way that Mark does. And I think that's in part because the author of John had access to Mark and to some degree is working with this material. Now, this is sort of my complicated way of pointing out that we don't want to treat these as four different witnesses to what happened to Jesus during the trial. It's really best to take Mark as representing the earliest strata, with other gospel authors reworking it to make Jesus appear harmless to Roman authority, and to make it appear that he really dies because of the hostility of the chief priest, and not because of the hostility of a figure of Roman power. So what do we know about Pilate and his relationship with violence and how he defined criminal behavior? Now, we don't actually know much about Pilate. Much of what we know or think we know comes from the New Testament Gospels and comes from the first century Jewish historian Josephus. An inscription survives at Caesarea Maritima that Pontius Pilate made when repairing what appears to be a lighthouse by many reconstructions. Recently, a signet ring has been excavated, and people debate whether it belonged to him or one of his subordinates. It depends on how you read the Greek, and that's not something we're going to get into the weeds of today. But what I did want to talk a little bit about are basically the phenomena that governors like Pontius Pilate defined as seditionist behavior, or could potentially define as seditionist behavior, because we know a bit about that from the Jewish historian Josephus in particular. Now, as I mentioned, Roman governors were often defining what was criminal on an ad hoc basis. They weren't always doing it consistently. But one thing that they are consistent about is that if you organize an armed uprising, you deserve to be violently repressed. And that's very, very consistent in first century Judea. And there are some examples of that appear in the sources. Their tendency is to execute or even engage in massacres of people who follow a charismatic preacher and some sort of masked demonstration that's supposed to have some sort of supernatural outcome. This is very likely if the people organizing the demonstration are not chief priests, but charismatic preachers who are competing with them or even criticizing them. And there are some examples of that appear in the first century material. Probably most important for present purposes are what happens or can happen when an individual with a small following goes to the temple precinct during a festival and does and says stuff that's incendiary and can incite a riot or crowd disturbance or violence. Because in those instances, the chief priests technically have an obligation to protect pilgrims who could be endangered. And so does someone like Pontius Pilate, theoretically. Now, an interesting example comes up in the 60s CE, and the figure of a person also named Jesus bar Ananias in this case. According to Josephus, during a major festival, he went to the temple and he preached that Jerusalem, and by implication, the temple was going to be destroyed. The chief priest arrested him, and they brought him to the governor Albinus on a charge of sedition. And by all appearances, according to Josephus's narrative, Albinus convicted him of sedition, but did not execute him. Instead, he had him scourged so severely that the flesh was peeled from his back, and people could see the bones protruding through this person's back. Now, people have often noted how similar this seems to be to the sequence in which Jesus is executed, with the difference that Jesus receives this awful scourging and then is crucified. Now, one way to understand this is that Pontius Pilate and Albinus, they share in common the belief that this type of behavior is seditionist. It's just that Albinus doesn't think it necessarily warrants crucifixion, and nor it warrants a form of disfiguring disciplinary violence. And perhaps Pilate has a more extreme vision. But what's suggested by this episode of Jesus bar Ananias is that if someone does something or says something incendiary at the temple precinct, they could find themselves being classified as seditionists by Roman authority. And so this is how I'm thinking about what Pilate is identifying as Jesus' criminal behavior. Not that I think Jesus committed a crime necessarily, but I'm talking about Pilate's own moral and ethical vantage point and how he might think of Jesus as having committed a crime. Now, when you read Josephus, you are exposed to many instances, as well as Philo, the Jewish philosopher Philo, many instances in which Pilate engages in repressive behavior. For present purposes, I can't go into great detail about these episodes, but a pattern of that I think that I've detected is that typically when dissidents engage in a mass demonstration, if they are supported by the chief priest or even organized by the chief priest, the tendency for Pilate is not to engage in a massacre or some sort of repressive violence. But if a mass demonstration of some sort is organized by rivals to the chief priest, charismatic preachers who might be opposed in some way to the political order or the hierarchy of wealth, then a massacre becomes more likely. Now, this doesn't mean that Pilate does whatever the chief priest wants, as the gospel suggests. That's not what I'm getting at all. But Pilate's own moral vision and how he understands a crime has a lot to do with the place of the chief priest in Jewish society and the relationship of other people to them. Now, in my research, one conclusion that I've drawn so far is that Pontius Pilate is not necessarily the first figure of Roman authority to classify Jesus as criminally seditious in some way. I can't really go into great detail, but I believe in various respects that there are traces in the Gospels of a hostility that Herod Antipas had to Jesus when Jesus was preaching in Galilee. Now, Herod Antipas is, of course, the same figure of Roman authority that executed John the Baptizer, who also was a very popular preacher, very charismatic, and said some things that Herod Antipas did not particularly like. What's noticeable about Jesus' preaching itinerary in the Gospel of Mark, I'm not really able to reach it, but basically, if you could see the Sea of Galilee, right, you'll notice that it's on the threshold of a lot of different territories with different governors. Jesus is often operating at that threshold and crossing in and out of Galilee during his preaching. And one plausible explanation is that he's actually anticipating possible arrest attempts. And thus he's moving in and out of people's jurisdiction depending on what's expedient at that given moment. Now, as it happens in his final week of preaching, right, he came to Jerusalem, which is the jurisdiction in a sense of the chief priest of the Jewish temple and of Pontius Pilate when he's there. Now, a big question that comes up is why exactly is Jesus not arrested right away? So according to the gospel narratives, he rides into Jerusalem on a colt in a very regal fashion, one recognizably messianic, according to many arguments. But in spite of that, he still gets to preach at the temple for at least a couple of days, according to the gospel narratives. He engages, according to the gospels, in confrontational behavior at the temple precinct. He, again, is not detained immediately, according to the gospel narratives. In fact, he's only really approached, according to Mark, by the chief priest essentially the day after. Now, my current theory is basically what's happening here is that Jesus appears in public only when he's in the presence of massive crowds that he can technically use for leverage. crowds that could become volatile if an arrest attempt is made, or there's an effort to be made on the part of the chief priest or Roman soldiers to overpower Jesus's followers. There are examples of, say, Roman soldiers trying to resolve a potential for violence, but just making it worse, because once Roman soldiers are involved, the ability to control them becomes very, very, very dubious. So I think what's happening is Jesus is making messianic statements at the temple. He's engaging in some confrontational behavior. The behavior is recognizably dangerous to the chief priest, who realized that if it gets out of hand, could endanger other pilgrims. They want to put an end to it, and they want to detain Jesus, but it's dangerous to do it in public in the presence of large crowds. And thus, they're going to try to shift strategies to find places where Jesus is really only in the company of his personal following, and not in the presence of, say, the pilgrims of Jerusalem, Jerusalem's public. Something that's also worth noting is that when Jesus is not in public, he does appear to be trying to move around Jerusalem under the radar of Roman authority and the chief priestly authority. I accept the premise that when he's procuring a place to have his final Passover meal, or when he's getting a colt to ride into the city, he's having his followers operate with sympathizers through secret passcodes that are couched by the Gospels as prophecies, but in historical context may really be representing how Jesus is engaging in clandestine communication with people. Typically, his location where he's staying is not well known to authorities, and that seems to be by design. So when Jesus is actually visible to, say, priestly authority or Roman authority, it's really when he has the leverage of crowds and their potential volatility as a form of deterrent. And I actually think that we see signs of this in Mark when it talks about how the priests confront him at the temple and they desire to arrest him, they want to arrest him, but the crowds are a concern. And I think that this actually explains, which I do deem to be more or less historical, a shift of strategy where they're going to engage in civilian policing, but they really are going to try to isolate Jesus, where an arrest attempt will not cause people harm, right? Where he might actually be in a remote location. When the arrest attempt occurs, I think that it is actually organized by the chief priest for various reasons, and I can't unfortunately explore them all now. Some people give weight to the Gospel of John in particular, especially if they believe that Pilate's responsible for the arrest, because the Gospel of John indicates that a Roman cohort and a Roman tribune were involved. The other Gospels don't really say this, but that's what John says. In my personal opinion, I think what's happening here, and I can reference Christopher Furman's book, is that when the Gospel authors write about Jesus' arrest, they depict policing mechanisms that were common during their own lifetimes. And the difference between the first and second century is that in the first century or early first century, civilian policing is more common. It wouldn't be too unusual for municipal elites like the chief priest to organize a posse and try to arrest someone who has a small personal following and leave it to the Romans to suppress like larger rebellions. By the second century, it's a bit more common for Roman soldiers to be involved in those types of arrest mechanisms. So I don't actually think that the Roman cohort at Jesus' arrest is actually historical. I still think we're left with the chief priest organizing an arrest attempt at a relatively remote location where the crowds were not as much of a factor. Now, when the arrest occurs, and I think a very brief hearing in which the chief priest deem Jesus liable for death occurs, he's transferred to Pilate. And my take on it is, in essence, that despite the protest of the Gospels, Pilate thinks of Jesus' activity at the temple as recognizably seditionist. Basically, that he's making some sort of regal statements, or at least that's what he's accused of by his enemies. He's doing things that can spill over into outbreaks of violence that endanger innocent pilgrims. And I think this explains why the Gospels retain these traditions where Pilate is constantly calling Jesus King of the Jews, and even has a titulus put on his cross, identifying him as such. That's not meant to be a compliment. It's meant to be actually hostile and mocking. And that explains that component of the Gospels. I think it explains the nature of the capital punishment that Jesus gets and why the Gospels report that he's crucified alongside seditionists or bandits, depending on which Gospel you're handling. For Pontius Pilate, who had a tendency to see activity that could result in violence especially if it reflected a perspective that was hostile to landed authority. What Jesus was doing was basically criminal. It might not be from our vantage point, and nowadays we often think of people who espouse the cause of the poor against, say, the established order as maybe doing something heroic. That's not the normative Roman vantage point when you're a governor. It's quite the opposite. These are the worst people, and I think that's what Pilate is basically thinking here. So in essence, I do think that for Pontius Pilate, his legal pathway to crucifying Jesus was contingent on his belief that Jesus had done something criminally seditious at the temple. Not all governors might have convicted him for doing the exact same thing. Some might have convicted him, but maybe inflicted disciplinary torture without the crucifixion. And that's where I think the variation in the perspectives of governors can be important, and the fact that governors often are defining crimes on an ad hoc basis. Perhaps if Jesus had a different judge, he doesn't actually suffer this iconic moment in his lifetime. Maybe he survives it. Maybe he's tortured and released. But that's my reconstruction of the trial in historical terms. And I thank you very much for listening. And I'm happy to take some questions if you have them. Thank you again. Yes, and tell me your name. Sorry.
Judy,
Judy, nice to meet you.
I don't know if your research would address this, but if Jesus spent that week dodging in and out and hiding, and yet we've been led to believe he was expecting it. There was the Last Supper and everything else.
Right.
How do those two things come together? What was his expectation of spending the week hiding out and then being arrested and so on?
Yeah, I mean, in the Gospels, he's anticipating that it's definitely going to happen. I'm not in a position to say whether or not that's true, but I think even if we accept that he didn't know as a matter of certainty it would happen, he and his followers knew that this was serious potential, right? I think he was anticipating that some sort of arrest attempt would occur, and that explains some of the clandestine movement. Perhaps he didn't see it as inevitable. Maybe he realized that there was a possibility he would walk out of Jerusalem and come back to the Galilee or whatnot. I think these things are all possible. But at this point, I think in my reconstruction that Jesus had preached in Jerusalem multiple times. Mark doesn't say this explicitly. John, of course, is known for depicting many more pilgrims and for often taking material from the synoptic gospels and placing it at other points in Jesus's ministry. But I think at this point, Jesus had preached at the temple on multiple occasions and had run afoul of authority in the city and anticipated that arrest attempts could have happened even if he hadn't been arrested previously. And I think this explains some of the material in the Gospels where he does seem to be trying to avoid detection. If that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. And yes.
Did I understand that you think that because the Gospels were written several generations after the death of Jesus, and the writers of the Gospels by that time were identifying themselves as Christians rather than Jews, that the attempt, whether it was sort of deliberate or just subconscious on their part, to place the blame on the high priests, Jews in other words, that is in a way that is an anti-Semitic action, and that it was a deliberately anti-Semitic.
Whether I would call that particular action anti-Semitic is something that I hesitate to do. I do think that it reflects a certain vein of anti-Judaism that runs through early Christian literature, but whether that's the same as anti-Semitism as it existed in modern times is something that people debate very heavily. What I do think, though, is that people have found some inspiration for anti-Semitic views in that literature, independently of what the gospel authors are intending there. I think their main intention, or one of their main intentions, is to define how they're different from other Jews. And when exactly they become distinct from other Jews is something that's also heavily debated. Some people would say not until really the 2nd century. But I think what's really crucial here is that they're really trying to depict themselves as harmless to Romans. And that actually, for my presentation, might actually even be more important. Oh, we're not people who are against Roman authority. You don't need to arrest us and execute us. I really think that's one of the things that the Gospels are trying to accomplish. But the problem is that to accomplish that, they really have to make Pilate look like he doesn't want to kill Jesus. And if he doesn't want to do it, then who does, right? And then that's where the chief priests really come into play there. Yes, a question.
I'm curious, and you may have already stated it, and it just went like this. Were there any other messianic leaders that were persecuted in the same way as Jesus?
Right. I would certainly.
Why is he our focus?
Well, that's a great question. Well, he's our focus because really of the rise of Christianity, yeah, I would say. Right, the rest of them don't get the same focus. I will backtrack just a little bit, although it doesn't, I think, represent all the key examples. Yeah, so starting with the death of Herod, right? And as I mentioned, you probably are familiar with opposition to Herod's royal legitimacy as couched in the Gospel of Matthew. After his death, what starts to happen is various figures start to lay claim to the title of king, which in Jewish society is basically Messiah, arguably, right? And we actually see them in Josephus, and typically they die violently. If they're captured, yes, they quite likely are going to be crucified, or they might be killed in combat and the like. So there are people who are either messianic preachers, and if they're not claiming to be messiahs, they might be just prophets who are still criticizing the established order, right? Who do die very violently. So, for example, these two prophetic figures are killed in Judea by Roman governors. They have a much bigger following at the moment that they're killed than Jesus, and that's part of the reason why they're presumably being targeted. But yeah, it's a period in which charismatic preachers who aren't in alignment with the chief priest, especially if they're doing it in very public places. If they're out in the desert, they probably are not really attracting as much, repressive violence or attention. But if they're engaging in armed insurgency or organizing mass followings as prophets, they are often dying and are getting killed by figures of Roman authority. Yeah. This one doesn't, but he still gets arrested and tortured. Yeah.
One of the questions I had many years ago, I had the privilege of going to a conference led by N.T. Wright. And
Oh my gosh.
and I asked this very question about the Pilate, the gospel writers trying to see him as an innocent person. And he assured me that Pilate was not innocent.
Pilate was not innocent, yeah.
Not positive toward the Jewish people from other things that he'd done, like mixing the Galileans' blood in the.
Right.
But what he said, and I thought it was very, very astute, was he said, you have to remember as these gospels are being written, where a time there was at least local persecutions of Christians.
Right.
And so you really don't want to come off hard against Roman constabulary
Yeah.
when in fact you're being arrested and killed. I mean, that would be a really stupid thing to do. So a lot of this is from, like you were saying, time that was written, a time period after Jesus died, that you see that nuance reflected back on how they treat Romans or how they treat. Well, and then you've got an Acts. I mean, what do you do with these faithful Roman centurions?
Right, precisely. Yeah.
Wow.
And what's intriguing about Acts, and the comment you just made, which I agree with, is that, if you take the Lucan author, assuming the same author writes Luke and Acts, right? Something that's received a lot of commentary in recent years is how a lot of the violence inflicted on Jesus' followers is basically portrayed as being inflicted by, say, Jewish rivals, whereas Roman figures of governance are often interceding in a way that's somewhat favorable to Jesus' followers, even if they're otherwise known from other sources as being totally corrupt, right? But they're siding with Jesus' followers. So when Paul's put on trial, right, before, the governor of Judea, the governor detains him way longer than he should, but, they're hesitating to kill, right, in Acts the Apostles. And that does seem to be the trajectory, especially as Christians do face some exposure to repressive violence from Roman authority. Yeah. And I think when in Luke in particular, Pilate is very elaborately depicted as really arguing for Jesus' innocence. And
Like, careful of this one.
oh yes, question.
Hi, I'm Trish.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you, and thank you so much.
Yeah. Oh,
Listen, I have a question about language.
sure.
And I know you didn't want to go down the road right away, but when you're looking at these texts in Latin and in Greek, which I imagine you might have,
Right.
are you seeing, what are some of the differences you're seeing? Or has the wording, I noticed you use several words for a number of things, which is
Right.
wonderful because it allows us to see what's the difference between seditionist and, I forget what else you put up there, but you're using these different terms that are used, and I suspect they come from either Latin or Greek perspective.
Right.
So I just wondered if during your research, how you see different language presenting almost a different scenarios and so forth.
I mean, the languages can lead to the production of different scenarios. But when it comes to terms like sedition, or violence or insurrection, I would say that the testimony of Josephus, who writes in Greek, is actually the words he uses are easily correlate to the Latin words that you often see in like Latin juridical material, if that makes sense. In terms of like the Greek Gospels, what I've often been doing is comparing passages because, especially if you're assuming or know that one of the gospel authors is reading another, then it becomes an intriguing question about why the wording is changing or why something's getting recast. I wouldn't say, at least in terms of defining what crimes are, the legal vocabulary has posed any problems that I've noticed. So for example, the word stasis in Greek is typically a very conventional way to describe an insurrection or sedition. And it's very similar to, the Latin term seditio and stuff like that. Yes, John.
Thanks for
Sorry.
a terrific presentation.
Mhm.
Assuming, and you're very persuasive, I think, on the responsibility of Pilate here, and I think that all of that makes great sense. Given that, how would you then describe, in terms of your conclusions, the role of the Sanhedrin and the Jewish elites in terms of this case? If Pilate is primarily responsible, what is their role?
Right. In some narratives, they basically are totally removed, right? That's sometimes treated as purely the fabrication of the Gospels. I am not inclined to see it quite that way. I do think that they play a role in the arrest in particular. Now, the way that I think about it is that there's a coordination between Pilate and the chief priest. But when we're thinking about the activity of the chief priest, I think we have to distance ourselves a bit from the characterization of the Gospels, which portray their motives as basically being unilaterally self-serving and oriented toward eliminating a rival for authority about whom they're jealous or think is a danger to them in some way. The way that I think about it is that in this period of the Roman Empire, the chief priests of Jerusalem, yes, they are ethnically and religiously Jewish. They also are basically Roman elites at the local level. And the obligations they're fulfilling by arresting Jesus are conventional obligations of Roman elites. And I think what we want to do there is basically focus more on how we're seeing a Roman patterns of behavior as opposed to, say, Jewish patterns of behavior. I think that's an important way to recast it. And in this sense, the chief priests are basically fulfilling an important obligation to compatriots, but also to Roman authority, right? By dealing with someone who might create disturbance at the temple complex. And that I do think is important. So I think that they have a role, but it's not, I don't think it's necessarily, we have to accept that it's as cruel or as vindictive as the Gospels portray. And of course, the Gospels have their own particular bias, right? And portraying the chief priest and as viciously going after Jesus. And I think actually apostles, to get back to Glenn's earlier point, does the same thing sometimes in portraying violence that Jesus' followers are suffering from people or by people in Jewish society. And you had a question?
Yes. when you first started, you showed us the map,
Yeah.
and I was curious if you were going to relate it to our time now. And especially when you were at the hillside there and saying, looking down over here, you were looking into the city. Were you going to say anything about what's happening now and where the here, who are they? The
Jewish.
yeah, the Hamas
Hamas.
and
Right.
all these people that are separated. On the map, where are the Gaza Strip and where are the people
Right, number
that
5, right?
Yeah, basically 5 is where the strip is, more or less.
Or that bottom.
Yeah, you see the gray area with the 5 on it. Yeah. Yeah.
um, that has nothing to do with what we're having problems with now. The Jews and the Gaza, the Hamas and all those are a different group of people and different problems than what we're having now.
I wasn't going to comment too much on that just because of my limit in expertise. The violence broke out actually when I was just arriving at the late ancient period in my world history course, and I referred my students to my colleague Ken Schul, John's colleague, because there's a Center for Middle Eastern Studies that's just opened up on Binghamton's campus. But something I will say, and something that I communicated to my students, is that some of the political circumstances of the 1st and 2nd centuries that they were looking at have bearing, because after those moments of Jewish insurgency, eventually the Romans expel Jews from Jerusalem. And over the course of the later Roman period, the Roman imperial authority will have a certain desire to make Israel Palestine into a Christian landscape, which is what it essentially does, right? A lot of Christian churches in Jerusalem, restrictions on the abilities of, say, Jews to convene there and hold, their own religious activities there, right? And so, what happens over the course of Roman imperialism in the region does have some impact on contemporary events, because it technically sets like a long-standing stage for there to be a dispute over, right, whom Palestine, Israel belongs to. But beyond that, I certainly don't have anything much to offer beyond the average layperson about the contemporary political circumstances.
Can I ask, maybe it's a comment, actually, I'm not sure whether this your historical period, but in the Nicene Creed, we say, crucified under Pontius Pilate.
Yes.
Yes.
And so by the time the Nicene Creed was written, clearly that whole idea that, well, it wasn't really Pontius Pilate, it was really the high priests, and which you've shown to not in your opinion not be the case. Do you have any idea when that shift occurred?
I'm not sure what shift you're.
Well, the shift towards squarely laying the blame on Pontius Pilate, even though in the Gospels, the 4 Gospelers try to, in a way, I won't say exonerate him, but at least share the blame with the high priests. Because in the Nicene Creed, the high priests don't appear, doesn't say.
It doesn't say crucified by Pontius Pilate. It
Oh,
says
that's true. It says
under.
under.
That kind of plunges the issue too.
Well, what's interesting is
That's important
Nicaea, of
language.
course, is a council that's being called by the emperor. And so it's interesting that you would mention Roman authority in that, that in almost a placating way, it's crucified, under punch. That's a very curious thing. But I mean, it was basically the Nicene Council and the Constantinople Council following that were brought together by Constantine. I mean, and so in fact, they got into such big arguments that Constantine had to actually go in himself and said, and kind of, what did they say, King? They take names and make everybody, behave.
Right.
I ask you a question about Luke's gospel.
Sure.
Because Luke has this funny story. Pilate sends Jesus to Herod Antipas.
Right.
Happens to be in Jerusalem, and Herod, and it talks about how Herod's looking forward to this because he's hoping he'll do some kind of magical sign or put on a show or whatever.
Yeah.
What do you make of that Pilate sending him? Was that him? You think that was one level of saying Pilate is saying, let somebody else do this?
Right. In truth, that's something I often have thought, right? Especially when I accepted that episode as more historical than maybe I do now. Like maybe Pilate's just trying to get out of doing this and is hoping he can make this particular case someone else's problem. What troubles me, I guess, about the historical accuracy is that it really only appears in Luke, that episode. And you see parallels with Acts, where for reasons that aren't entirely clear, a governor of Judea, right, hands over Paul to, right, to give a speech to Agrippa II. So this seems to be something of a literary motif of the Lucan author, one that enables him to basically put Jesus' followers in front of Jewish figures of Roman authority who then say, oh, he's totally innocent, right? And I think in Luke, it's intriguing because it's really, if I recall correctly, earlier in Luke, there's a moment, I think, where Pharisees tell Jesus that Herod's out to get him, right? Yeah, they warn him. And so in Luke, there's sort of the staging that, oh, Herod's out to get him. But then when he actually encounters Antipas basically just dismisses him and sends him back to Pilate and doesn't seem to have an interest in condemning him per se. So my tendency is to think of that as a device of the Lucan author, one that recurs also in Acts of the Apostles, in essence. I should also mention, though, in reference to your question, I wish I could remember the name of the author. There's actually a book called The Innocence of Pilate, and it's about how Pilate is characterized in late antiquity. And what's intriguing is that in spite of the Nicene Creed, a lot of patristic authors basically argue for his innocence, that he's not culpable for his role in Jesus's death. He had an important role to play. Technically, he had to do it if Jesus is going to fulfill, right, his cosmic mission in a sense. But otherwise, in late antiquity, there are, works ascribed to Pilate. There's a tradition that Pilate became a Christian. And various things happened to rehabilitate him in a sense, in spite of that wording in the creed that you rightly mentioned. Yeah.
Do I remember correctly that during the trial, it's Pilate who asks Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?"
Yes.
And Jesus sort of deflects the question, right? He says, "Others call me that." Or something like that.
In Mark, he says, "You're saying it." Yeah.
I mean, given the import of King of the Jews in your interpretation there, that in a sense, Jesus realizes that this is a critical life and death matter, possibly, to be able to be laid to claim that label at least.
Right.
That would just, I think, sort of underline, your contention that the King of the Jews, with Pilate using that is an indication of his guilt.
Right, and it's intriguing that in the Gospels that Jesus is really not depicted as mounting a rhetorical defense, right? Paul does it in Acts of the Apostles quite a bit more elaborately. And in pertinence to your question, right, at a certain point, assuming that this is accurate, right, maybe Jesus realizes that, once he's on trial, the death at this point can be expected, and maybe it makes sense to not resist the label.
But he doesn't claim the label either.
Yeah, not explicitly. At least in my recollection.
That's pretty consistent.
Yeah.
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 How important was it the betrayal, which led to the arrest? If the betrayal had not occurred,
Right.
what would the transactions in that week led into?
Right. Now, in the gospel narratives, the betrayal by one of the apostles is, of course, pivotal in helping the chief priest identify the location of Jesus's campsite, right? I'm not in much position to say whether that particular iteration is historically accurate, though I do think in general, somehow the chief priest identified where Jesus was camping, whether he's portrayed by one of his immediate following as something that I can't claim to know. It certainly plays a very important device, right, in the narrative account for a variety of reasons. But if I were to do like contrafactual history, I think what happens that if the chief priests aren't able to find the campsite where Jesus is located and never arrest him, presumably he preaches longer, he leaves, maybe he comes back and preaches again, and what happens to him in his final Passover happens on that Passover.
Okay.
But conceivably the game continues, right? In the way that all the players are playing it. Perhaps.
It's interesting that that they need Judas to identify him as a person. In other words, Jesus was not so out in front that everybody knew him by sight.
Yeah, precisely. They identify the location and his identity and the literary sequence, certainly.
Judas kisses.
Yeah. Yeah.
Although, of course, I mean, it could have been the equivalent of wearing a hoodie, because, you see 12 people all wearing hoodies, you don't know. They did wear garments which covered their heads, I think, especially at night.
And it's dark out, yeah.
Which,
We didn't have news pictures all over the place either.
Yeah. It's true.
Well, we are at the end of our hour.
Oh, wow.
So,
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.